Trek to Yomi doesn't leave the best first impression. You're thrown into the game basically immediately after a super quick combat tutorial where you learn basic moves and combos, and right away it feels a bit off. If you've been watching previews of the game like I have, your major concern was most likely the combat because it looked pretty stiff in some of the showcases, and especially early on in its most primitive form, I gotta say it warranted that scrutiny. It's not a very satisfying combat experience. What was meant to be the saving grace of the game and its main appeal was the story and visuals, and while the latter pulls its weight from beginning to end, the first hour and a half or so features a story that feels exceptionally well trodden, even to somebody like me who just has a passing interest in samurai media. It featured the classic themes of revenge and duty to your people in a pretty straightforward way, and aside from the great aesthetic and the serious effort put into creating unique combat areas with great framing, I didn't find much to attach myself to early on. As time went on though, I think the game did get better. To what degree, I'll get into more in a second, but the combat and story did improve as they went along. So given this game is coming to Game Pass, I'd say anyone that's looking to give it a shot should play about 2 hours and see if they like where it's headed. If you don't, you're probably not going to be all that into it by the end, but if it clicks with you eventually in that time frame, just keep pushing through. The mid to late sections are definitely an improvement in my eyes. With that said, let's get into more specifics. The best and most consistent thing about Trek to Yomi is exactly what you expect it to be, and honestly, exactly what it needed to be: the presentation. I was playing the game on Steam and it was running really smoothly. I didn't really notice any dips, although certain effects were sometimes a bit slower than I felt like they should have been, like the fire effects, and that sometimes gave the impression of a performance dip. Other than that though, this game is a sight to behold. It's constantly changing angles, giving fresh perspectives, framing action really nicely, and putting you in situations that feel like the climax of a movie. The rooftops of a burning building, or a solo duel on a bridge viewed from below, or a fight behind a shoji. It always felt very inspired, and I never got tired of looking at this game, especially when it would pan out and show long stretches of land or buildings with a lot of detail. And the changing perspective kept things as fresh as they could be in a game where 99% of what you do is run and hit people with a sword. Even multiple hours into the experience, I was seeing new ways of framing the action, and more mystical scenery began to rear its head as the story continued, which I think is a perfect fit for the second half of this game. It definitely could have gone its full runtime in a realistic setting and still looked great, but the mystical edge let it become even more eye-catching and daring with the situations that it puts you in. I'm trying not to show too much of the later sections since I like to keep reviews to the first few hours of the game, but just know there is a lot of cool visual design here. Those visuals accompany a story that's not the most complex or introspective, nor one of the more thematically bold takes on samurai stories that we've seen, but one that I still think is ultimately presented pretty well. At first, it's just a story about an attack on the village that leads to our main character seeking vengeance on the man who led the attack, but in doing so, he leaves his village vulnerable, and by the time he returns, it suffered the consequences. This leads him on a spiritual journey that forces him to acknowledge his faults as a leader in that moment, overusing the excuse of being tricked or deceived, and along the way, reaching closer to the land of the dead, he occasionally crosses paths with the woman that he loved who's passed away. The game has a few moments, like 3 or 4, where it asks you to choose your path, and it offers you basically the same options every single time. The exact wording changes a little bit, but the gist of the 3 options are: be a colossal dumbass who didn't learn his lesson, be a simp, or honor your duty to your people. Can you guess which one is the good option? I don't mind these choices being really simple. I wound up picking the best option each time, which led me to finishing the game in a touch over 5 hours. I think you can make it shorter by being whipped, but it does highlight how the game's not actually saying all that much that we haven't seen or heard before. It's about a samurai's duty to guard those under his protection above all else. That's not exactly new ground, but credit where it's due. I certainly like that the game decided to show this journey by taking Hiroki to Yomi, the land of the dead, in order to face his mistake head on. It's not the most moving or unique of tales, but it certainly has its merits. What I think is the absolute biggest flaw of this game though is the combat, and the sad thing about it is it's pretty much broken across the board, from the core of how it plays to the most effective strategies to use. At the most basic of levels, Trek to Yomi's animations make Hiroki look like a cutout action figure. There's something unnatural about how he resets to do a second overhand swing, or how he turns back and forth, that clashes with the rest of the game's style. It just seems a bit cartoony and floaty. But while that's something that you can look past pretty easily, a much more fundamental problem lies in the parry mechanic. Not that the mechanic itself is weird or broken, but it's trying really hard to be cinematic and instead comes off slow and clunky. Whenever an enemy is about to attack, they do so incredibly slowly, like a movie where they show an attack in slow motion and the parry hits and the swords spark and clash and release, and then you go back to full speed. It's a fun, added cinematic flair to a choreographed scene in a movie, but it has no business being attached to every single attack in the game. Parries take little to no skill, even on hard difficulty. If you wanted to, you could just pull off most parries by spamming the button, and they feel a lot less like the epic clash that the game intends them to be, and more like you and your opponent are moving through molasses. I would get if this was something that you'd see on the easy difficulty. I'd even somewhat understand it on normal, but if I chose a challenge, it's a bit weird to be given these massive windows that I basically have to try to miss. Some enemies are a tiny bit faster, but it's really not by much. Now, the game does improve in this facet going forwards. Once it throws a few more enemies at you, it at least starts feeling a bit more like a juggling act, and to its credit, it does give you a consistent string of new combos to play with, not just mixing light and heavy attacks, but also variations that include holding the stick in a certain direction or ones that utilize quick turns. But those combos kind of introduce a new problem. See, the game has a staggered state for enemies, and it's only triggered by specific combos, one that start with some variation of light attacks and end on a heavy. And staggering an enemy is hands down the best way to deal with them because A, you can pull off a finisher move that, while also being kind of a clunky animation that could certainly look a bit better, will instantly kill that enemy no matter how tough they are, other than bosses of course. And B, you regain a significant amount of health when you do these attacks. There are absolutely no benefits to doing any other type of move. A counterattack off a parry will restore 1 health point, but other than that, nothing else gives you health, and nothing else gives you instant victory, which makes most combos redundant. You can so easily go through this entire game pulling off one move the whole time. Only 1 or 2 rare enemies are impervious to being staggered, and that brings into question why the other moves even exist. Especially on hard difficulty, I noticed that some tougher foes could take 10, 11, 12 hits, 3 full-on combos, and still not be dead. But then I could just hit them with the sleeper poke and finish them instantly while also getting health back. You don't even need to hit them with every part of the combo, just the last hit, meaning that fights can go from a battlefield that takes a dozen strikes to kill certain enemies, full of parries and fancy moves, to a field of health pinatas that you can stand a bit back from, hit once, and then move on. I tried my best to keep things entertaining by not overusing those stagger combos, but then it just felt like I was tickling enemies with a feather. And by the end, I actually turned the game's difficulty down to medium because I just assumed enemies with less health might be a bit more fun to face, and I was right. I actually recommend this game on medium. Attacks and combos feel a lot more balanced here, and hard isn't really much of a challenge anyways. The game does have a few bosses. Most of them are really simple and easy to learn. There's a couple in the middle that have cooler arenas and designs that kind of shake things up because you can't parry them to my knowledge. It actually forces you to use your roll to squeeze under their legs. They're not anything to make a big fuss about, but they're fun enough and a change of pace of what the game asks of you. The enemy variety is passable, though it does suffer slightly from annoying late game enemy syndrome. There's some basic puzzles that usually just come down to look at the symbols around you, maybe press a button to reveal one of them and then put them into this dial thing. They're nothing special. And in terms of bugs, I did have one crash and one instance where this boss I was fighting in a 2D plane started attacking on the Z axis for the first half, so everything was missing me. But that was only once. There's not really anything to sound the alarms about here. This game is pretty well optimized. Trek to Yomi is a game which I was really excited for and also cautious about. I love the style, I love how it melded 2D and 3D action, and I was excited for its story, but I was a bit trepidatious about how the gameplay would come together, and now that I've played through it, all I can say is that it matched my expectations, both high and low. I was hoping for the gameplay to surprise me, considering how much of it there is in this game, but it never got past tolerable, and at its worst, it's just boring. It's a shame because with a tighter combat system and some rethinking of the stagger mechanic, I think Trek to Yomi would have been a top-tier game in the genre, but there's so many systematic issues with how it plays for it to hit that mark. It still has its fair share of positives. I do think it's going to find a fan base, and by the time it becomes retro in 10 to 15 years, people might call it an underground classic. But right now, it just doesn't match up with the current standard of how action-adventure games play. Still, it's free on Game Pass, so those using that service should pick this up and play to see it for yourselves. I remember seeing some previews that were more positive on it than I am, so you might not mind some of these issues. Thank you to Devolver Digital for providing me with an early code for the game. Thank you guys for watching to the end. If you're new here, subscribe. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.